Hello and welcome to the Tank Index. Today, I'm kind of split on this video because on one hand, in the future, I'm not sure I'm going to cover artillery tractors because, they're not really tanks. If you consider tanks like tracked vehicles, technically these are tanks. But, it's in the same way that I'm not covering armored cars, Or, it's the same way, am I going to cover half tracks, stuff like the M3? I have no idea. Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? So this could be an exception. The main reason I did it was basically because while doing research for the light tank series, I found that parts from the light tanks were used in these tanks, which led to me just being like, fuck it, why not? So that's why I am doing one on the light dragon and the medium dragon, which are two British artillery tractors. People are probably going to comment Anglophile for this. Great. So onto the history. In Vickers Armstrong in 1929 basically decided, let's just start producing some artillery tractors because, we have all these tanks we made and, we have some parts left over from them. So, let's just slap them on these boys. We already have the factories to produce those parts. Let's just make some of these. They designed the medium dragons, on the right to carry, medium to lower end heavy artillery around. And the light dragon would really carry smaller field guns. So the Mark 1, it was made at the Woolwich Arsenal, and it was intended to carry a QF 18-pounder gun, which was the main British field gun in World War I, as seen above, or, whatever the foreign equivalent of this gun was. The chassis and running gear came from the previous light tank Mark II, and had a horseman suspension and some horizontal springs, and the vehicle would have a clutch brake steering system and a flat front panel for its armor. It had a two-man crew, as well as a, Mark 1A alternate version, which has some sloped front armor, which is nice. The Mark II would feature a more powerful engine along with better armor and some better crew accommodation. It would carry on the sloped frontal plate from the Mark 1A, and in general, it was kind of just to improve the Mark 1A. The Mark 2B had different running gear, more like the light tank Mark 3, and some sources do claim that the Belgian T-13B3 tank destroyer was based on it. And a single one was bought by the Belgians. But the vehicles are really quite different. There's also a Mark IIC and a Mark IID with some minor changes. Onto the Mark III. The Mark 1 and 2 were fairly high quality, more expensive vehicles. So in 1934, because it's like, alright, the market for these things is kind of low because lots of countries can't afford them, especially with, the 1930 Great Depression starting. So they're like, alright, 1934, Vickers is like, let's design a cheaper one. So we had the DA-50, which itself would develop into two prototypes. We had the machine gun carrier Mark 1, which would turn into the Bren gun / the universal carrier. The Bren gun carrier, not the Bren gun itself. And then we had the Light Dragon Mark III. Unlike the last two, it didn't have any Vickers machine guns, along with a far different suspension. The frontal armor was returned to a flatter one, though it did have better protection for the driver. Its engine, gearbox, and transmission was made by Ford, having a V8 engine, seen on some American tanks. It had a much improved steering system, including skid steering with a steering wheel. And 69 Vickers D50s would be converted to the Mark III. I couldn't find numbers for the other two. So in general, the light dragons were pretty decent vehicles, assuming of course that they remained in support roles only in avoided combat situations, though at least had a machine gun, right? It could lug around light artillery just as intended, and they were pretty high quality. This quality led to some still being around in World War II, because, unless your field guns become drastically bigger, which they did over the course of World War II, but in the start, especially with the Depression, if assuming your field guns remain the same size, it's kind of, assuming you also take good care of these, it's kind of hard for them to become obsolete because their role is lugging things around, so it's kind of hard to become obsolete with that. But the Mark III, meanwhile, it was much cheaper and solely restricted to support roles, with not even having anything for self-defense. And these would just last less time, as they tend to just wear down faster. But in general, though, they were solid enough artillery tractors, and that's one of the reasons I'm not really planning to cover all much artillery tractors, because they're kind of boring. I like tanks because they're cool. They're big vehicles with fat guns. They shoot you, right? And these are like, we carry stuff, which is important to a war, but it's kind of boring.